The Tarkin Doctrine was introduced in 18 BBY, shortly after the foundation of the Empire, as part of a communique Tarkin gave to the newly minted Emperor Palpatine. It represented the Empire's governing philosophy of how to keep the galaxy together under one superstate, and more or less their political military strategy. So there are three principles to it. I'll just go through the first two quickly, and we're mainly going to talk about the third. So the first principle was the reorganization of the galaxy into larger sectors or oversectors. So the galaxy would be taken from having thousands of smaller sectors and reorganized into oversectors, each of which would be ruled by a Grand Moff, and each of which would have a massive oversector navy and a massive oversector army, and they would function as basically semi-independent emperors, and they'd have their own private kingdoms. Palpatine would also provide them with, I guess you could call them super weapons. It depends whether or not you want to call a super Star Destroyer a super weapon or not. But a lot of Moths were given them. Like Artis Kane was given the Reaper, and Zinj was given Iron Fist. And that very much fits with Principle 3. So the idea was, now that you have these massive oversectors, the rebels can't just jump from sector to sector after doing a raid. The Grand Moss would be able to pursue them across their whole territory. They could leverage all the resources, and the Grand Moths were highly ranked enough that they didn't have to go to the Emperor for permission to do everything. The second principle was I would describe it, I think, as the nationalization of the HoloNet, where the Empire would seek to control all HoloNet transmitters. The idea being to restrict communication between individual sectors to prevent their enemies from spreading ideas or coordinating, to better control the media, and to ensure that all the sectors were constantly in communication with the oversector and with Coruscant, to kind of limit the autonomy and independence of the various local governors. The third principle, and the one we're going to focus on today, is the rule of fear. And when people say Tarkin Doctrine, they're most often referring to the rule of fear. The idea that Tarkin came up with is that it would be the only practical way for the Empire to police such a large piece of space would be to rule through the threat of using force rather than force itself. And that was kind of the impetus behind creating just how like Imperial Star Destroyers look, how Stormtroopers look, how AT-ATs look, super weapons like Super Star Destroyers, like the Death Star. There was a focus on, I guess you could say, style over substance and on intimidation over practicality. And for a long time, I've been extremely critical of this. I thought Tarkin was really stupid and that this didn't make any sense. Because I was like, well, the Death Star, they could have built thousands of Imperial 2s for the price of the Death Star, or they could have mass produced TIE Avengers or TIE Defenders and actually had decent starfighters. And to a certain extent, I still do hold to that position. The Empire definitely could have built more anti starfighter frigates like the Lancer. They could have built better starfighters. They could have actually put some anti starfighter cannons on the Imperial Star Destroyer line. So I'm not going to say that the Empire didn't screw up, but I at least understand the logic behind it, and it does make a certain kind of sense. So before we get into it a bit more, I think we have to describe what the political and military situation was in the Empire compared to the Old and New Republic. Now, the major advantage the Old and New Republics had was the central government really didn't interfere much with the member worlds, and they were largely allowed to do what they wanted so long as they weren't engaged in slavery or pirating or smuggling or attacking other member worlds. I'd also imagine if they were committing internal genocides, the Republic would probably intervene. But generally speaking, membership was voluntary. So you didn't really have to worry about worlds rebelling and leaving. They would just stay in because they wanted to stay in. In fact, the New Republic heavily encouraged planets to have their own planetary defense forces and kind of small armies. So that freed up an immense amount of resources because they didn't need a massive navy because they were generally speaking regarded as being legitimate, and the planet stayed loyal to them out of, I don't know if affection's the right term, but they didn't stay loyal just because the gun was being held to their head. On the other hand, the Empire wasn't really regarded as being the legitimate galactic government by a lot of, perhaps a majority of the worlds it controlled. I mean, certainly the non human worlds wouldn't have considered it legitimate. A lot of the near human worlds probably wouldn't have either. And even some of the human majority planets didn't like it much, and they kind of missed the autonomy that they had enjoyed under the Republic. So the Empire was kind of forced to militarily occupy most of the galaxy, or at least large portions of it. So they needed a much, much larger fleet. Like how the New Republic's military doctrine worked is individual planets had their own planetary defense forces that were provided for and managed by the member state, and then they had central rapid response forces like the Fifth Fleet that were made up of new model ships or the best ships that money could buy. And the idea was this heavily armed, highly advanced battle fleet would go in and fight in specific conflicts. Like if there was a large conflict, like an Imperial fleet was attacking, they'd send them in, or to hunt down pirates. But in general, they didn't have to worry about directly controlling the known galaxy. I think I was trying to think of an example of kind of a similar situation. I think the two that kind of come to mind are the case of Soviet Afghanistan, or just Afghanistan in general. Because or not necessarily Soviet, but communist Afghanistan controlled the cities and population centers, but outside of those, they couldn't really effectively exercise power. And that's kind of it, like the Empire, where there were pro-imperial worlds in the core and deep core, and they were heavily populated. But the galaxy is a very large place, and trying to deal with that is pretty difficult. It's also, I think, kind of reminiscent of what the Japanese had to face when they were occupying large portions of China. And the local population obviously hated them and saw them as being completely illegitimate. So they just had to pull in more and more soldiers to just place areas under military occupation. And it kind of got bogged down and became a quagmire. If you look at the Old Republic, the only cases I can think of in which it almost collapsed were because of external factors. During the New Sith Wars, the Republic did collapse because of a Sith invasion. During the Great Galactic War, I think it was, in the Galactic Cold War, it collapsed because of a Sith invasion. I don't know how you want to count Darth Revan's uprising. I mean, that was inspired by a response to the Sith Empire, but I guess you could say that was kind of a civil war. In the end, it was brought down not necessarily by its own problems, but because of two Sith who'd spent like decades doing a 4D chess plan, and who were two of the smartest people to ever exist in the history of the galaxy. So, I mean, your mileage may vary, but my point being is it was normally an external enemy that took the Republic down. What probably would have happened if Palpatine hadn't have come along is there would have been some social, political, and economic chaos, and the Republic would have probably just passed reformed itself. They would have had just another Russian Reformation, maybe brought back a military, maybe gave the Senate more power. There would have probably been some sort of reform, which is generally what happened in the past. So that being said, you might go, well, that's not too difficult. I mean, the Empire's huge. They have massive resources. They have planets with billions of people. They can surely militarily occupy the entire galaxy. Well, the truth is they really can't. So there's 1.5 million member worlds in the Galactic Empire at its height. So I don't know how big a member world is. I'd imagine it's a couple hundred million to tens of billions. So you have 1.5 million highly populated worlds, and then another 69 million colonies. Now, a colony I imagine can range from something like Bespin, where you have Cloud City, which is maybe like 1,000 people, but that would be a colony. So they're probably not particularly large, but that gives you over 70,000 places you have to provide a garrison for. And that would range from, I don't know, a couple of guys to like a massive army on a rebellious planet. And as it turns out, Star Destroyers are very, very expensive. So the Imperial 2 had a lot of flaws with it, but in terms of its intended role, which was in my opinion, to effectively control a sector, it was generally speaking pretty good at it. And Imperial 2 had so many guns and was so big that realistically there wasn't really much that could fight it. Unless the rebels got really lucky with starfighters, and the Imperial 2, even if TIE fighters aren't good, it carried a lot of them, and it's not like they were to danger. Even they'd either have to get lucky with starfighters, or they would have to risk a couple of their very valuable, very rare Mon Cal capital ships to fight one. Star Destroyers also had a legion of stormtroopers. They had prefabricated garrison bases. So if there was a rebellious world or a rebellious city, they could set a whole like garrison base down to maintain control. AT-ATs, obviously bombers. Imperial Star Destroyers themselves had tractor beams. They could glass cities. It was a very effective tool for controlling a large portion, or for controlling a sector. But they're extremely expensive. I forget which source book it was, but it said something like it took 12 years of economic output from a relatively prosperous mining colony to produce one Imperial 2. And like it was so expensive to build them, the reason they're painted gray is it was the only color that could be afforded. So despite like despite conscription, despite the massive increases in taxes, the military required was so expensive it just wasn't possible to build one large enough. At its height, the Starfleet had 15,000 Imperial 1 and Imperial 2 class Star Destroyers, which sounds like a lot, but once again, you have 70 million worlds to police. So that's like one Imperial Star Destroyer for every 4,600 worlds. That's just not going to work, because if they attack multiple ones, what are they going to do? Send like the Imperial 2 to two different worlds? And even if they have smaller ships, the Rebels might just be able to destroy them. I mean, the Rebels didn't have a huge conventional army, but they were able to beat the Imperials in conventional straight up fights. Mon Cal ships were very good, and their starfighters could pretty easily deal with smaller ships. So you have this issue. They can't produce enough ships to occupy the galaxy. There's a clip I really wanted to use here from Blade Runner 2049, but YouTube doesn't allow me to use clips in reviews. So it's the scene where Wallace is looking at the recently created replicant and is just kind of lying on the floor. And he kind of bemoans the fact that the process of growing or cloning replicants is too expensive and too time consuming. And regardless of how much he ramps up construction, he's never going to be able to meet the demand. He's never going to be able to create enough replicants to allow humanity to colonize the galaxy, which is why he tries to search for an alternative way with the finding of the replicants that can reproduce. So what Tarkin was thinking, and I think what Palpatine eventually came around to, is okay, we don't actually have enough force to garrison the galaxy. So what we need to do is create weapons that are so terrible, that are so frightening, that it'll make most planets unwilling to rebel. To kind of create an artificial version of what the New and Old Republic had. That if they could get like 80% of the worlds to basically cower in fear before the might of their super weapons, then the Imperial Navy and the Imperial Army could handle the rest of them. The Death Star, for instance, wasn't necessarily designed as any kind of practical weapon. It was designed to scare all the 70 million planets within the Galactic Empire with the knowledge that it could just show up and blow any of them up. It is very similar to the whole mutually assured destruction thing in the real world with nuclear weapons. Another benefit of the Death Star is it would allow the Empire to win any conventional battle against an openly rebelling planet handily. So, something to keep in mind is prior to the events of A New Hope, Mon Calamari had been in rebellion for a couple of years. So, the Mon Cal sector had, I don't know how exactly they did it, but they blocked off their hyperspace lanes. It's kind of on the periphery of the Imperial space, anyways. They had heavily mined it. They had built massive defense platforms. They kind of totally mobilized their economy to producing more and more capital ships. And obviously, if the Empire had have just brought in, like, let's say the Mon Cals have maybe like 100 capital ships, a couple dozen massive defense platforms in their minefields. Sure, the Empire could have brought in something like 1,000 Star Destroyers and probably won, but that would have meant taking like a massive portion of their navy away from critical duties elsewhere. And it wasn't a guaranteed win because they weren't really sure. They might lose dozens or hundreds of Star Destroyers because of the mines. The Moncals had probably jammers and all kinds of plans to deal with such an eventuality. So if the Empire lost a conventional straight up fight with the Moncals, it would just massively delegitimize them, and no one would really be able to take them seriously again. The other thing is if they won but they took massive casualties, that their ships are so expensive they might not really be replaceable in the immediate term. But also it would show that yeah, you can fight the Empire. You may not necessarily win, but conventional force does work. So the idea was they were just going to jump in with the Death Star and just shoot the planet. You can't really do that with Star Destroyers because planetary shields will block turbo laser fire. So the Empire could have tried to just jump in and bypass their defenses, which I don't think you can do actually, but and just try to slag the planet, but they couldn't do that. Whereas the Death Star would just shoot right through the planetary shields, and destroying Moncal would have been a symbol to the rest of the galaxy that resistance was futile, to use the Borg term. It's also interesting if you look at the Star Wars books. It's very rare that the Empire is able to muster more than a couple dozen ships, even for major battles. If I recall, Zinja's battle fleet that he used for conquest was the Iron Fist and like a dozen Imperial twos. I think that Thrawn only had a couple dozen ships. Isard, when she was defending Coruscant, I think only had like half a dozen Star Destroyers, and the fleet that she had with her on Typhon was I think it was two Imperial twos and a Victory class and an interdiction cruiser that she got from Pterodok and obviously the Lusankya. So in practice, most of these ships were out policing and trying to protect the periphery. So they weren't really able to bring a large amount of force to bear on any one point. And the idea is the only real solution they had was to use super weapons to scare most of the worlds into submission. And so that's kind of why you had the scenario of them kind of banging their heads against the wall and constantly attempting to build new super weapons when the previous ones failed. Because it was really the only card they had to play. Now, once again, I think they were, to a certain extent, a waste of money, and they should have put a lot more resources in beating the rebellion in conventional combat. Because the way they had their fleet set up was just not very good at it. So they could have like a lot of like they could retrofit start Imperial Star Destroyers to have a lot more anti-fighter weapons. They could have actually just sucked it up and spent the money to build at least shielded TIE interceptors, if not. They could even give each Star Destroyer maybe one or two TIE defenders or a couple TIE Avengers, or had dedicated fleets that had them as like rapid response forces that could actually take on Rebel starfighters and win. Also, they could have, I don't know, done something a bit better than AT-ATs. I get that they want something intimidating, but I think they took it too far with style over substance, to the point that they just kind of completely conceded the idea of winning in a conventional war. So no, I don't think the Tarkin Doctrine was stupid. And it's interesting if you kind of try to evaluate its record during Operation Shadowhand, because on the one hand, pun intended, it the super weapons and the dreadnoughts, the Republic basically just ran from them because they couldn't even like really, if they're facing like 5 or 6 super star destroyers, there's really nothing they can do against that except for run and abandon the planets in their path. At the same time, though, building super expensive projects like the Eclipse or the Galaxy Gun, while they do have their strengths, it also means if they get destroyed, then they kind of are putting all their eggs in one basket. Personally, of the Imperial super weapons, I think the two best ones were the Galaxy Gun. For those of you who haven't read Dark Empire, the Galaxy Gun fired hyperspace speed projectiles. so it could shoot from anywhere in the galaxy and hit any target in the galaxy. It also had a hyperdrive, so the idea was it would reposition after every shot. And that was devastating because the projectiles could blow up planets, they could blow up space stations. I'm not sure if they could hit ships. Like if the projectile, they might have been able to hit capital ships, but it was truly a terrifying weapon, and it was a lot better than the Death Star, in my opinion. The other weapon I liked was the Sovereign class Star Destroyer, which was basically a pocket sized version of the Eclipse. It had a super laser, but I think it was only about a tenth the power of the Death Star, but that was still enough to shoot through planetary shields and scorch continents. So while far from perfect and deeply flawed, the Tarkin Doctrine isn't like the total retardation that I initially thought it was, and it does actually make sense in a lot of different contexts. So that's today's Sci-Fi Pulsi. I haven't done one of these for a while, but as I've said, these things take a lot of thought and a lot of research to put one of these out. So I can't do this or history videos that often. But I hope you enjoyed the video. God bless, and more quality content to come.